Trita, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Great to be with you.
Well, there's so much to talk about, but I first want to just also remind our audience to make sure you smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm. And Trita, I just want to get right to it because there's so much to discuss with you. Despite all the sort of triumphalist rhetoric that's been coming out of Washington and Tel Aviv for the past couple months, this U.S.-Israeli war in Iran has not exactly gone according to plan. Iran did not collapse. Trump seems to be kind of like searching for an off-ramp constantly while also simultaneously escalating. And we'll talk about why that's happening. But Netanyahu, on the other hand, is kind of openly signaling that he wants a much longer regional war, especially with regard to Lebanon. So, I want to talk to you about what you've been arguing, which is that, despite all the rhetoric with Trump, he's really looking for what you call a silver bullet, which is essentially like trying to declare victory while also exiting the conflict. And a lot of this is actually due to Trump looking to the hawkish pro-Israel think tank, Freedom for Defense of Democracy, for guidance. So can you talk a bit about what's going on here? It doesn't seem like Trump really has any options left other than to either finally compromise, which eventually he's going to have to do, or just continue this war and lose more.
So when I reference the search for a silver bullet, it is essentially a pathological pattern that we see in U.S. foreign policy towards Iran, in which the U.S. side is constantly looking for that one action, that one sanction, that one bombing, that one point of pressure that just causes the Iranians to surrender, to capitulate, and enables the United States to avoid what I think is unavoidable, which is to actually have a compromise. Something that sustains the picture of the United States as the superpower that doesn't need to compromise with a country like Iran, that can simply force its will on that country. And this is not just Trump. That's why I'm saying it's pathological. This has been pervasive in U.S. foreign policy towards Iran, and I'm sure towards many other countries. But Iran is one of those countries that is constantly challenging the United States, which then triggers the American desire to subjugate it, to send that signal. You can't challenge the United States. If you challenge the United States, it will cost you dearly, and eventually you will be forced to subjugate yourself to America as well. And Trump, perhaps because of his own personality, his desire to always look as if he's winning, is arguably even more susceptible to this psychology. And if you take a look at just the pattern of the last year, we see clearly that Trump has, as soon as he's ending up in some form of trouble, but even without that, is looking for that silver bullet. Earlier on, just in December, just the mere threat of the US attacking Iran was considered to be that silver bullet. And we have numerous occasions in which Witkoff expressed publicly to the media that Trump is frustrated and confused as to why Iran has not surrendered yet. There is that belief that surrender is in the cards. You just have to find the right silver bullet. After the threat of war didn't work, then it was the idea, okay, well, we're going to get a small military action against the Iranians. We'll get the Iranians to even accept it. They will only respond politely, and then we'll go for the surrender. That didn't work. In the talks, despite the fact that Trump had a deal on the table that was better than what Obama had achieved in the JCPOA, he nevertheless rejected it because surrender would be even more sweet. And he thought that surrender was in the cards. And then we saw in the beginning of the war, the silver bullet was taking out the Iranian supreme leader. There was a belief that after that, the Iranian system would implode or they would just capitulate. This is part of the reason why Trump told Keir Starmer that the war will only take 3 days, why he told GCC leaders that the war will be maximum 100 hours, 4 days, because of this belief that there is this silver bullet. And once you utilize it, the Iranians will be forced to surrender. They did it. The United States then goes on this massive campaign, soon realizes that the Iranians are escalating horizontally and actually is gaining escalation dominance because they can crush the global economy and Trump's political future. And in that, the search, one would think that perhaps there would be a desire to say, okay, let's find a way out of this and let's find a compromise. But instead, the pathology is that you then become even more intense in your search for a silver bullet. And your bar for what you would accept as a silver bullet becomes lower and lower. You become more and more desperate, and you're willing to go along with almost anything. And this is where then the blockade on the blockade comes in. Suddenly we're thought to believe that because of the blockade, even after Iran has been bombed, even after all of that, this blockade suddenly will cause them to collapse. And this was sold to them, of course, by FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, a very bizarre name for an organization whose purpose essentially is to advance the image of Israel and the interest of Israel in the United States, according to their own founding papers. And I would suspect that they have been behind quite a few of these silver bullets. They were definitely behind the entire maximum pressure strategy that Trump adopted in his first term. And again, it turns out that the silver bullet is just a regular bullet that doesn't do much. In fact, in many ways, makes the US's position worse. The blockade of the blockade in particular is that. Because Trump actually had gained disproportionately from the ceasefire when the Iranians agreed to it. Because Trump managed to get himself out of the war, oil prices were coming down, but the Iranians had not yet managed to get the key thing they wanted, which was sanctions relief. But that pressure release that he achieves through the ceasefire, he then erases through the blockade on the blockade, because it actually pushes oil prices up, because you're taking more oil off the market, you're intensifying the conflict. And in fact, during the ceasefire, we ended up having 2 or 3 weeks into it, we ended up having higher oil prices and higher gas prices in the US than what we did during the war itself. And the blockade of the blockade is a very important factor as to why that is the case. So we see this pattern in which the search for a silver bullet actually tends to backfire, only worsens the US's position, intensifies the conflict, and makes it more and more and more difficult to actually get to a real deal. The only president that had the political will and the foresight to break that pattern was actually Obama through the JCPOA. He too tried the sanctions path, but then once realized that the sanctions clock was ticking slower than Iran's nuclear clock, shifted, went for a real compromise, and that ended up in the JCPOA after 2.5 years of very intense negotiations. But it was a genuine compromise. There's plenty of decent criticisms against that deal. There's plenty of completely invalid criticisms against that deal, but it is unique in many ways for one reason. And that is that the United States of America actually went for a genuine compromise with a country that in the view of the US is not even a middle power over a longer conflict that had been between the two. And that is not usually how the United States does its business. But when it does, it actually serves US interest better.
So I want to ask you about the Israel's aims versus the U.S. aims here, because Netanyahu said in this recent 60 Minutes interview, I know you saw it, that basically Israel intends to maintain indefinite so-called security control across the region, and he framed this war as part of a broader effort to basically permanently reshape the Middle East. He wants to continue this war for as long as possible. And as a result, the goalposts keep shifting. The agenda keeps shifting. The outcomes they're looking for keep shifting. And he was talking a lot about, well, now we have to go in and we have to take their nuclear material away by force, which is something we've heard from the Trump administration sometimes. But Trump's also doing something similar. He's always shifting the goalposts. But at the same time, Trump does appear eager for a way to end this on his terms. But he doesn't seem to want this to go on forever, whereas Netanyahu does. So I guess I'm wondering, how serious is this contradiction, where Israel's pursuing goals that even Washington might not actually be prepared or willing to sustain?
I think the divergence between the US's and Israel's interest here are extremely deep, and they always have been. This is part of the reason why 4 or 5 previous presidents rejected the Israeli pressure to go to war with Iran, because there was a realization that any such war would not lead to a clean victory, but rather a continuous state of warfare in which the Israelis would do to Iran, or that was the aim, what they are doing to Gaza, to Lebanon, they did to Syria, they did to the West Bank, or does to the West Bank, which is mowing the lawn. This is their term, in which they just constantly go every 2 years or every 6 months, whatever the circumstances are, and bomb these countries in order to make sure that none of them can gain any type of a power that would enable them to challenge Israel. So this is an Israel that does not believe or does not want peace, but thinks that its security is only achieved through complete dominance. In order for it to be secure, everyone else has to be insecure. None of them should be able to have the ability to challenge Israel. Take a look at how this manifests itself in US law. Take 2 examples. The US actually has written into its law that Israel needs to have a qualitative strategic edge in the region. That means that the United States does not sell advanced weaponry to other countries that it sells to Israel. Israel always has to get the best weapons, because it is aimed at serving Israel's goal of being able to dominate the region militarily. No country or combination of countries in the region should be able to challenge Israel. It also means that in Lebanon, where you're sitting right now, the American strategy has been to strengthen and train the Lebanese armed forces, but only to the extent that they can take on Hezbollah, never to the extent in which they can deter Israel. So it's not about Lebanon's security. Lebanon's threat is clearly coming from Israel, which is constantly bombing it, ceasefire or no ceasefire. But the US would never enable the Lebanese army to have the strength to be able to deter Israel, because that would completely contradict the fundamental position of supporting Israel's military domination in the region. Nevertheless, there is a problem in all of this, because it's one thing for the US to support this against Lebanon, against Syria, against Gaza. It's a completely different story if you're going to support it against Iran, a country that Israel cannot take on its own. This would not only lead to that same state of endless war, but to a far greater degree of instability and the recurring pulling in of the United States into the war. And that's not the US's interest. The US is happy, content, or at least not bothered by the fact that Israel is bombing Lebanon on a regular basis, or Syria on a regular basis, or certainly Gaza on a regular basis. Could not care less. We just have to be honest about that.
Yeah.
But if it was bombing any country on a regular basis that would force the US into that war, that changes the equation. And that's how that equation changes with Iran. So previous presidents have not gone along with this, because they didn't want to have that endless state of war with Iran or any country. Whereas from the Israeli standpoint, that's just normal. That's how you get security. There isn't any belief in peace or desire for peace. I don't know exactly where on that spectrum most Israelis fall, whether they don't believe in peace because they don't desire it, or whether they don't desire it and the other way around. But let me give you an example. In 2004 or 5, when I was in Israel, an Israeli general told me he was very depressed and worried about the future, because he said, when I fought in 67, when I fought in 73, we genuinely believed that if we beat back the Arab states, eventually they would accept us and we could have peace. We thought that that warfare would lead to peace. Whereas today, he said, that's not what the youth believes. And this is 20 years ago. They believe that we're just going to be in an endless state of war, and that's just the way things are. And we're just going to have to constantly beat down everyone on our neighbors, and our security is based on their insecurity. He was right to be worried, because there's no way any country could sustain such a military doctrine, certainly not such a small state as Israel. The only way they can sustain it is as long as they can get that massive amount of support from the United States. And that appears to be coming to an end sooner than most people expected, because of these dramatic shifts that are taking place in the American public vis-a-vis Israel, both on the left and on the right.
Yeah, we'll see what's left of Lebanon and Gaza when that finally happens. But you're absolutely right. Israel can't sustain multi-front wars if the U.S. turns off the weapons tap. They'd have to stop. But I also want to ask you about the limits of U.S. power. And I raised this because there was this remarkable Atlantic piece that's circulating, written by Robert Kagan, who's an interesting character because this is, somebody who's been a career neocon, and has for a very long time been one of the leading voices arguing for a war on Iran. But in this piece he wrote for the Atlantic, he sort of concedes to this new reality for Washington, which is that the U.S. defense industrial base may no longer be capable of sustaining a major prolonged conflict against an industrial power. And he compares America's military vulnerabilities to to China, and sort of manufacturing, and then also warns that decades of neoliberalism and outsourcing hollowed out America's wartime production capacity, which again is quite ironic given that, the neocons have been proponents of all of those things. But it was interesting to see this from him specifically in a place like the Atlantic. And is specifically talking about the Iran war and basically saying America's losing and is going to lose. And I'm curious how significant you think that is, a realization like that for someone like him. And I'm not sure if Robert Kagan, I don't think he represents neocon thinking in 2026, but he certainly represents something. And so I'm curious your thoughts on all that.
So I have to admit, I haven't had a chance yet to read the article, so I have to be a little bit careful.
Okay.
Because I don't know if there is perhaps a subtle argument there, which is that, well, we're losing it because we're not doing X, Y, and Z. We should do X, Y, and Z, have an even more intense military-industrial complex in order to win these things. So I'm not entirely sure whether he's completely given up on American hegemony and primacy. But if at a minimum he's recognizing that this is a strategic defeat for the United States, that obviously is a very significant development. We've also seen that both him and Bill Kristol have ended up expressing some pointed criticism against how Israel is conducting itself vis-a-vis the United States. If that is based on a genuine shift of belief or whether they're just reading the political temperature of the country, as everyone else is, and seeing that this is, supporting what Israel is doing and supporting what Israel is doing in terms of dragging US into various wars is a hell of a losing position to take. So whether it's because of that or whether there is a fundamental rethink of realizing, hegemony is wrong in so many different ways. It's not sustainable, it's morally questionable, it's actually not providing security. If that is what is happening, then I certainly would welcome that. I'm just not so sure yet if that is the case. But I also have to give Kagan the benefit of the doubt in the sense that I haven't read his piece, so I can't.
Fair. Well, I want to go back to the specific issue taking place right now between the U.S. and the Iranians when it comes to this back and forth of, I don't even know, do we call them negotiations? Because the U.S. doesn't seem to be willing to compromise on anything, but also seems desperate to end this. And, when it comes to the miscalculations that were made, the biggest miscalculation really did seem to be over the ability of the Iranians to close and disrupt the Strait of Hormuz. Somehow that managed to shock Washington and, of course, the global markets. And so I'm curious, is there a way out of this for the U.S. without compromising? Because they keep trying all of these ideas that aren't working. You had the sort of Project Freedom last week that lasted for literally 24 hours, if even?
Enough freedom. 24 hours.
It's enough for us. Too much freedom. Too much freedom. Turn off the freedom.
Yeah, look, I think this goes back to what we said earlier on. There is that desire for that silver bullet. And as long as that is the priority, there will not be a deal. There is no deal unless there's a compromise. There may end up being a scenario in which there isn't a deal, but there also isn't a war. It would be very bad for both sides ultimately, but politically, Trump may find it more convenient. giving those compromises should not be as hard as it has become. I think there's some obsessions, frankly, on both sides. One of the critical obstacles right now is that the US side wants the Iranians to give up 100% of its 60% enriched uranium. And the Iranians in the past actually gave up 98% of their stockpile in the JCPOA. But they appear to have become very suspicious as to why the US is so insistent on this specific point. And I think it may have triggered a degree of paranoia on their end, in which they are thinking that, perhaps there's something even more valuable in the 60% that we haven't quite figured out on our own. Why is it that Trump is so adamant about getting that? So the Iranians have dug in their heels and are not willing to give up the 60%. They're offering to downblend it. They're offering to potentially, based on some reporting, and I haven't been able to confirm this, downblend a portion of it, ship out another portion of it, which in many ways should be fine. But on the other hand, that's not what Trump wants. And on the other hand, I mean, if you're going from 98 to 100%, does it really make a big difference? Now, the Iranian side would argue, well, there's been 2 wars in between those decisions. There's been a lot that has changed. But I do hope that both sides digging in their heels on this one variable does not end up costing both of them a deal on all of these other issues in which both sides actually have shown some flexibility. And they lose the entire package because of this issue. And again, it seems to be driven by both sides more because of symbolic reasons than because of substantive reasons. On the American side, I've not been able to get a clear answer. Why is this so important? And my takeaway is that it's either because the Israelis are pushing for it, and we've seen how Israel pushing for specific variables or red lines have ended up becoming adopted by Trump in a manner that has been designed to sabotage the diplomacy. Or it is because Obama got 98%. So Trump got it. I'm not kidding you.
That's so petty.
So even if the totality of the package fundamentally is stronger than Obama's deal, there is like this laser focus on the 98%. And this is perhaps where the Israeli angle is coming in. And I want to be very clear. I don't know the answer to this. And I'm speculating. And I think in some ways, if this is a poison pill pushed by the Israelis, it is not as clear-cut as the zero enrichment was. The zero enrichment was very clear-cut a poison pill because it was absolutely clear over 20 years the Iranians were not going to give in on this issue. You can't say the same thing about the stockpile because the Iranians did give up 98% of their stockpile in the JCPOA. So again, I think there's nuances here that goes beyond what, some not simplistic, but simple explanations that were accurate in the past. And then on the Iranian side, again, not clear to me why this has become so important. They gave up 98% of the stockpile. It wasn't even a major issue. Not in the sense that they weren't pushing back, etc., but within the debate of Iran, it was not at the level that it is now about the stockpile. And mindful of the fact that the Iranians may not even know exactly where it is, they may not even know how to get the stockpile, it is weird that something like that has become such an important issue in a negotiation. And again, I think it goes more into the symbolics of this than on the substantive side.
Well, then on the other hand, too, you have another outcome of this is going to be a pretty big change in Iran's relationship with a lot of these Gulf Arab states, right? Specifically, I would say the UAE first and foremost. The UAE has just demonstrated a level of hawkishness that's been quite shocking to watch, especially because they don't really have the military capabilities to back it up. But I mean, we learned just recently that the UAE was actually launching strikes on Iran directly on their own after the ceasefire had gone into effect. I mean, that's a pretty big change and a pretty big deal. So I'm just curious your general thoughts on the dramatic shift in the relationship between the UAE and Iran after this war.
I think we have to go back and reassess where the UAE actually has been on a lot of these different issues. The Abraham Accords was not just some sort of a weapons deal. It was really a much deeper integration between Israel and the UAE, and then later on Bahrain. A lot of the other GCC countries are very upset at the UAE because the Emiratis brought in the Israelis into the Persian Gulf, allowing them to have an intelligence and military presence. We saw that during the war. The Israelis shipped over Iron Domes to the UAE. For many of these countries that actually tried to prevent this war, they blame the UAE to a certain extent, not entirely, for having helped bring about the circumstances that enabled this war to take place. Now, we also see then that, as you pointed out, they have attacked Iran themselves. Now, whether that came after the Iranians started attacking the UAE is also an important question in all of this. If the Emiratis were doing this or allowing Israel or the United States to use their territory, again, to attack Iran, which is what the Iranians are saying, then there is a degree of understanding as to why the Iranians would target the UAE. This is what most other countries would do. And then that may have gotten the opposite reaction from the Emiratis, in which they actually gone deeper into this war. The fundamental error, in my view, of the UAE is the decision to go into the Abraham Accord in the first place. Because, and this always stunned me, I wrote about it at the time, I didn't understand how they had made that strategic calculation. Because the Emiratis' own tensions with Iran go only so deep. I'm not saying the relations are great, but between Dubai and Iran, traditionally, it actually has been quite good. But whatever the enmity is, the depth of that enmity is very shallow compared to the depth of enmity between Israel and Iran. But by going into the Abraham Accord, the Emiratis attached themselves. They made themselves an annex to Israel's enmity with Iran that goes much deeper, with one very critical change or dimension that is really essential here. They are so much closer to Israel than what Israel is to Iran. Sorry, they're so much closer to Iran than Israel is to Iran. Meaning they attach themselves to another state's enmity with Iran while they're a frontline state against Iran. So obviously, if there was a war, they would take the brunt of that war. What did they expect? It's a different thing for Morocco to go and join the Abraham Accord. And suddenly we saw in Morocco a very strong anti-Shia rhetoric and blaming Iran for supporting Algerians, etc. No real evidence, but it was these kind of things they had to say to sell it in various places. But Morocco is on the other side of Africa.
Right.
It's very far. It doesn't carry any risks for them, but it carries tremendous risk for the Emiratis. They have now experienced those risks. And perhaps they're too deep into it to be able to extract themselves, but the stupidity strategically of that decision, I think, should be clear to all at this point. They had their own tensions with Iran. They made it 100 times worse by attaching themselves to another state's enmity with Iran, whereas that state is, 1,200 kilometers or whatever away from Iran, whereas the UAE just sits across the water from Iran. And now when they're here, it doesn't seem like they have the ability, the creativity to get out of it, or perhaps they're just so dependent. I mean, this is one of the things that happens. How could they extract themselves from this when now they have made themselves, over the course of the last couple of years, so dependent on Israeli technology, on Israeli intelligence?
Yeah, it's so baffling. You're just kind of like, why would you do this to yourself? But then, yeah, once you start that relationship, it's almost like there's no going back. As we reach the end here, I guess I want to ask you for some predictions, which I know is not easy because we've been kind of feels like we've been stuck in a time loop for the last 2 months, especially since this ceasefire went into effect. It's like the same story every few days. One day it's a threat of civilizational, and the next day it's like, oh, there's some positive things happening, and you never know if it's to manipulate the markets or if it's real. And it's really hard to predict, but I guess we could talk maybe about scenarios here, because there are a few different ways that this can go. And also there's, a runway, and that runway is getting, shorter because of the fact that the longer the Strait of Hormuz is closed, the more there's really severe consequences, for the world. And that includes, by the way, the US at some point. So I guess, do you think we're moving towards an actual negotiated settlement, like as a possibility here? Do you think there's a possibility it could turn into another hot war like it was for the first month? And then or do you think the more likely scenario is what you were talking about, which I've heard people frame it as a kind of unsettled settlement, which, as you said, would essentially benefit the Americans more than anybody else, where we're, kind of stuck in what we're stuck in now, but somehow the Strait of Hormuz opens up. I'm not sure. But yeah, can you talk about maybe the different scenarios and which one you think is most likely?
Yeah. So the unsettled settlement was a scenario that could have existed had he not imposed a blockade. The blockade was a gamble he took, thinking it would bring the Iranians to the knees, but is now backfiring and putting more pressure on the United States. And it's very difficult for him to undo the blockade without getting something from the Iranians. So now we're in a scenario in which within the next 4, probably 6 or 8 weeks, we will know which side is hurting the most and can sustain the blockade of the blockade. If the Iranians are hurting more, which I don't suspect is the case, you will likely see them either trying to escalate matters in the Persian Gulf in order to make the, shift some of the cost of the blockade, make it more costly to the US and other states, or you will see them trying something new at the negotiating table. I suspect it will be the former. If it is the US, then you will see things such as Project Freedom, some other variation of it, something else. And I don't think that's going to work either. And the question is, those attempts, will they lead to a full-scale war? Or will that scenario go on for a couple of more weeks? I don't think it can go on for much more than 8 or 10 weeks. At some point, this is going to break because the blockade of the blockade made that unsettled settlement unstable. I'm not saying that it was fantastically stable before, but it was much more stable than it is now. So that instability at some point is going to give way. Can it go towards negotiations? It absolutely can, but it will require far greater flexibility on both sides, doing away with some of these obsessions that currently exist, reducing the entire package to just one variable of symbolism. It will require a paradigm shift in which Trump also must understand, yes, by all means, have a narrative of victory. Declare yourself the victor. Talk about how awesome you are, but do it in such a way that does not negate the other side's narrative of victory. Because they also will need to be able to declare victory. And they're kind of careful of doing it in a way, at least more careful than Trump is, to make sure that it's not humiliating to the other side. Now, I'm not saying that the Iranians are great at or anything like that, but so far the real problem has been the rhetoric of Trump. There are ways for him to be able to declare victory without necessarily humiliating the other side and negating their narrative of victory. But I would not put that chance at more than 20%. There is a higher risk that there will be another round of military strikes. This was not my assessment prior to the blockade of the blockade. Prior to the blockade of the blockade, I thought that the situation would be stable enough that it could go towards negotiations, but a deterioration into war I put at less than 5%. The blockade of the blockade changed that picture dramatically. And now the risk of war is far more significant than a return to negotiations.
Wow. Well, we're all exhausted. So I would have assumed the people making the war are exhausted too, but maybe they're not and they're ready for another round.
Not exhausted enough.
Not exhausted enough, apparently. Trita Parsi, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute. And again, everyone go check out Trita's Substack. Fantastic analysis.
Trita Parsi.
Trita Parsi on all social media platforms. Trita, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it. Thank you.